If you've spent any amount of time researching how to do an upgrade from a legacy version of Exchange, and by legacy we mean anything prior to Exchange 2010, the minute Exchange 2010 was released, all other previous Exchange versions became legacy. That includes Exchange 2007. So if you've done any research on upgrading to 2010, you'll find that the terminology is not exactly what you might expect. And in some cases, the terminology is used incorrectly, but Microsoft makes it very clear that there are terms that they want used when you're discussing the type of movement in upgrading your Exchange organization. To begin with, it's important for you to realize that there's no in-place upgrade to Exchange 2010. Now, what that means is you cannot just take an Exchange server that's running Exchange 2007 and install Exchange 2010 on top of it. Even though there's a tremendous level of similarity between the two Exchange infrastructures, it's just not done that way. Microsoft did not create it so that you can install it right on top of Exchange 2007. And the difference between Exchange 2003 and 2010 is so extreme that that's not even a possibility whatsoever. So you have a few options. For starters, you can deploy fresh. And what we mean by deploying fresh is you can install Exchange 2010, make it its own organization, and then you can worry about creating new mailboxes and so forth. Of course, keep in mind that if you had a pre-existing Exchange organization, none of that information is going to carry forward. So it all depends on the amount of work that you want to put into your Exchange 2010 upgrade process. Now, most people are only going to deploy fresh if they have no pre-existing environment. So let's assume you have a pre-existing environment. At that point, the next question is, what do you have? And the reason why that's so important is because depending on what you have, that will determine whether or not the term used for your move to Exchange 2010 is migrate or transition. Now, migration, this is an option for those that are using, let's say, Lotus Domino or even a legacy Exchange version like Exchange 5.5 or Exchange 2000. The concept of migration is you can install an Exchange 2010 organization and you might be able to move mailboxes. You may even be able to move some of the configuration over, but it's not the same as a transition. A transition is something you're capable of doing from Exchange 2003 or 2007 over to 2010, and it carries with it not only the mailboxes, but also your configuration information. Now you might wonder, well, what's the difference really between a migration or a transition to Exchange 2010? Ultimately, you're on Exchange 2010 at the end. But when you think about all of the work that you've put into your messaging environment, it's important to carry some of that forward into the next version of your messaging infrastructure. So whether it's Lotus Domino moving to Exchange 2010 or a legacy version of Exchange, you want to do the best that you can in pulling all of that forward. So how do you accomplish that? Well, it's good for you to realize that TrainSignal is not only looking to promote Microsoft-only tools. So there are times when you may want to look to a third-party solution, and this is actually one of those times. Microsoft does an excellent job with providing lots of other tools for Exchange, but when it comes to transitioning, unless you're transitioning from Exchange 2003 or 2007 over to 2010, you're going to want to look for a third-party solution. So 2003, 2007 to 2010, you can go with Microsoft only. If you're looking at Lotus Domino or Exchange 5.5, 2000, you might want to look at other tools. Now personally, and this is just my personal opinion, I like Quest. I like the Quest migration tools because they actually allow you to be in a state of coexistence with the legacy Exchange environment. So if it's 5.5 or 2000 or even with Lotus Domino. So you might look at Quest or you might look at some other third-party solutions in order to help you to transition to Exchange 2010. Now with Lotus Domino, you might be wondering, well, didn't Microsoft create a transition suite for that? Yes, there is a Microsoft Transporter suite. However, it's only for use with Exchange 2007. So, if you are going to migrate from Lotus Domino to Exchange 2010, here's the recommendation. Start with Exchange 2007. Use the Transporter Suite, which is a free set of migration tools that Microsoft provides. That will help you to migrate from Lotus over to Exchange, and then you would transition from Exchange 2007 to Exchange 2010. Now the same might be said for Exchange 55 or 2000. You can actually move from 55 to 2000 to 2003. You can do these migration hops that will bring you closer to 2010. Okay, so there's a lot involved here, but keep in mind every environment is going to be different. It's not a one solution fits all type of discussion when it comes to transitioning or migrating. Now we've used the word transitioning. Basically, transitioning involves introducing an Exchange server or Exchange servers into the environment and moving over mailboxes. So if you have Exchange 2003 or 2007, what we would do is we would introduce an Exchange 2010 server into the environment and then move over mailboxes, which means we would obviously have to have a mailbox server in place. So you might say, well, what other roles will I have to install? We're going to talk about that in a moment, but obviously you're going to need a mailbox server in order to move mailboxes over. The idea is to move over the mailboxes, and if you have any public folders, to move over the public folder structure, and then to start decommissioning your legacy Exchange servers. Now this is something you might do very quickly. You might set up the Exchange server, move over the mailboxes, make sure the public folders replicate, and then start decommissioning. And if you only have a few Exchange servers, it's something you can do in a day perhaps. But most larger organizations are going to require a period of coexistence. Now, coexistence is the state of your Exchange environment when different versions of Exchange, legacy and the current version, which would be Exchange 2010 in this case, when they're running side by side within the same Exchange organization. So if you have an Exchange 2007 organization and you introduce that first Exchange 2010 server, you're in a state of coexistence. Right up until the point where you decommission the last of your Exchange 2007 servers, you're in that state of coexistence. So that's just the period of time where both are running side by side. Or in some cases, you might even have three different versions, 2003, 2007, and 2010, all running together in a state of coexistence. Now you might say, well, is there anything wrong with that? Is there a problem with keeping that going for a period of time? Actually, there isn't. You can stay in that state of coexistence for as long as you'd like. However, in order for your mailboxes to take full advantage of the features that are available with Exchange 2010, they're going to have to be on 2010 Exchange servers. The same is true when it comes to unified messaging services, when it comes to all of the new features that you are looking for out of Exchange 2010, you're going to need to make sure that you move things over in order to see those features on all of those mailboxes. So obviously it just depends on how long it takes for you to transition. And once it's done and the legacy systems are gone, well, then you come out of that state of coexistence and then you have a pure Exchange 2010 environment. Okay, so let's take a step back and let's look at this visually in terms of what we're actually doing when we perform a transition. So for starters, you see here we have a typical Exchange 2007 organization. It's typical because it includes the hub transport, client access server, and mailbox role. You know it's Exchange 2007 because it has the little logo for Exchange 2007 there. So we're looking at a situation where we have a single server, we have mailboxes hosted on that server, and perhaps the powers that be have decided we're going to move to Exchange 2010. The features are just too compelling, we're going to make the move. Okay, so the first thing you're going to need to do, being that we can't do an in-place upgrade of this server, which would certainly be great, but being that we can't do that, the first thing you're going to have to do is set up another server. So you can do that physically by installing a secondary server and installing the primary roles that are necessary, which in this case include the hub transport, client access, and mailbox server roles. And of course, if we had the unified messaging server role, then you would install that as well, and this way you would be able to transition those features over to the Exchange 2010 side as well. But just looking at this from a very simple perspective, we now have two servers up and running that are capable of running the organization, but it's still an Exchange 2007 organization. All we've done is introduce this Exchange 2010 server into the mix. And we'll talk about momentarily why it's important to have the various server roles and how to install those roles and in what order you're going to install those roles if you're going to do it piece by piece. At this point, we're ready to move mailboxes. So you can use the wizard or you can use the PowerShell commandlets to move those mailboxes from the Exchange 2007 world over to the Exchange 2010 world. Once the mailboxes have been moved over, and once everything's been tested and everybody is safe, everybody's functioning just fine, once you're confident that your public folders have replicated if you use them, and once you're confident that your Exchange 2007 server environment is really not performing any substantial tasks for your organization, at that point you can start to decommission those Exchange servers. And once those servers are out of the picture, you're no longer in a state of coexistence. You have now completely transitioned over to the Exchange 2010 environment. Okay, so now let's talk about a few important points that you want to keep in mind. And again, remember, every organization is going to be a little bit different, so some of these points may not necessarily apply to your circumstances. For example, the first one here, if you have an Exchange organization that is running Exchange 2003, you need to make sure that that organization is set to native mode. So that's something you do within the System Manager, where you select the Exchange organization and up it to native mode for that 2003 environment. Now, in order to accomplish this, this means you have to take any Exchange 5.5 or Exchange 2000 servers and demote them, get them out of your organization. So you may need to replace them with servers running 2003, or simply decommission them if you've already transferred mailboxes off of those servers. But whatever the case, if you're not working with a third-party solution that allows you to exist with these legacy servers, you're going to need to get rid of them. And so once you've done that and you make sure that all of those servers are out of the picture, then you want to move to native mode for at least 2003. The next item on the agenda is something that applies to both Exchange 2003 and 2007, and that is, in both cases, you're going to want to make sure you're running Service Pack 2. Or for a mixed environment where you have Exchange 2003 and 2007 servers in the same environment, you need to make sure those servers are running Service Pack 2. You're also going to want to make sure that the Active Directory Forest functionality mode is set to at least 2003. Also, at least one global catalog server in each site should be running Windows Server 2003 Service Pack 2. Now, as far as order of deployment, this is a very important subject because if you do not install certain roles, then you really won't be able to do the transition. So what would be the best case scenario? Well, the best case scenario would be if you can just install a single Exchange 2010 server with all of the necessary roles. And by necessary, that would be mailbox, hub transport, and client access server. And if you have a unified messaging server to move over, then you'd want to make sure that's installed as well. However, some organizations will want to go with a more staggered approach to deployment. In that case, the order would be client access server first, then hub transport server, then unified messaging server, then mailbox server. There's actually a very good reason for this order. When you compare Exchange 2010 to the roles and how they worked with Exchange 2007 or even prior to that, there have been some major changes made. Remembering that your main goal is to move over mailboxes, you might think, well, I want that mailbox server role installed first. But those mailboxes will be worthless to you if you cannot send and receive email to them. So your users will be stuck. What's required to send and receive email is a 2010 client access server and hub transport server. Without those, the mailbox server role will not even be able to function. So that's why you do need to put the client access and hub transport server roles in place first before you even think about installing the mailbox server role. So you put all of these roles in place, you move the mailboxes over, and then, if desired, you decommission those legacy roles in your organization. But keep in mind, your new roles will serve side by side in parallel with your existing server roles. So this way your Exchange 2007 or 2003 servers can continue to function, and your Exchange 2010 servers will continue to function. But for the most part, they will have to be maintained separately until you can start decommissioning the entire legacy branch. Now, a solid piece of advice from the Microsoft Exchange team, if you're dealing with a multiple site transition, is to start with one Active Directory site at a time. you begin with your internet-facing sites first. That's only logical because those are the ones that you're going to have email coming in from. You're going to have people connecting in, let's say through Outlook Web Access or Outlook Anywhere, some of the ActiveSync mobile devices. So you want to start with the internet-facing sites. Additionally, you want to keep in mind your host name and certificate issues when it comes to Exchange. Microsoft recommends that you switch the host names, your DNS connection host names, to your Exchange 2010 servers. Those Exchange 2010 servers will know how to handle the requests that relate to older versions, mailboxes that are on older versions of Exchange. But the older versions will not know how to work with Exchange 2010. So once you have your client access server and hub transport servers up and running, you're going to want to point off to your Exchange 2010 servers. Now, you're also going to want to provide a legacy host name so that Exchange 2010 knows how to work with the legacy systems. But when it comes to certificates, Microsoft is recommending that you use as few certificates as possible. And so one of the things that you might want to look into is obtaining a Subject Alternative Name Certificate, or for short, they call it a SAN certificate. This allows for multiple host names to be put on the same certificate. And so you might say, well, what am I going to do with all these host names? What am I creating host names for? Well, keep in mind, you're going to want to have host names for different aspects of connection to your Exchange. So for example, mail.whatever.com might be your Outlook Web Access host name. And so you're going to want to make sure that that host name is connected up with a certificate. You might also want to ensure that you have an auto discover host name, and that also should be part of the certificate. And being that you're still working with legacy servers, it's recommended that you create a legacy host name, legacy.whatever.com. So this may sound a little bit too involved, too deep at this point in the game, but we're mentioning it now so that you have in mind that you're going to want to look at certificates and how you're working with those, as well as your host names, to ensure that you have everything in order before you actually do the transition. Now, one of the coolest things about moving mailboxes with Exchange 2010, or at least the coolest thing that I think Microsoft has developed here, is the ability for us to do an online mailbox move. And in order to really appreciate this, you have to know that previous transitions called for mailboxes to be offline for a period of time while they move to the new server. Now, we say a period of time, but depending on the size of the mailbox, that could be 30, 60, 90 minutes or more while an individual is waiting to access their mailbox. Because while the mailbox is offline, there's nothing that the person can do. They can't access their mailbox while it's in that period of transition. If you have a tracking system for the availability that users have to their services, well, your percentages are really going to take a hit if a user can't access their mailbox for 90 minutes. Exchange 2010 eliminates this problem by allowing the mailbox to be moved while still online. Now, the only stipulation here is that we're talking about a move from Exchange 2007 with Service Pack 2 over to Exchange 2010. So if you're transitioning from 2003 over to 2010, we're still doing an offline mailbox move. And it's still going to take the time away from your availability percentages. But this is still a really cool feature. The fact that that mailbox, what happens is the data is moved over, but the user still has access to the mailbox where it's originally located. And then what winds up happening is, right towards the end there, as everything is moved over and everything is duplicated, right for that last little moment, the user is told to restart Outlook. So the user gets this little message that says restart Outlook, they restart it, and they don't notice any loss of service. So we're talking about the difference perhaps between a 90-minute move and being offline for 90 minutes as opposed to 90 seconds to restart your Outlook. That's a huge thing, really. And the nice thing too about this is that rather than trying to manage the move of mailboxes while users are home, let's say, you can do this at any time because we're only talking about a 90-second difference. Now, again, that's only if you're moving from 2007 to 2010. So we realize that it doesn't fit in every circumstance. But that's what we've been saying so far, that transitioning is not something that is a cookie cutter discussion. every organization is going to have a different setup. You're going to have a different legacy exchange install. You're going to have perhaps Lotus Domino or some other messaging solution in place. So it's always going to be a little bit different depending on your needs. But this is really a great feature that works really well. So the way you do this is you can use the wizard through the Exchange Management Console, or you can use the new commandlet get-move request. For those of you who perhaps used the old commandlet in Exchange 2007, maybe when you were transitioning over from 2003 to 2007, you would have used the move mailbox commandlet. But now we're getting a whole new commandlet, get-move request. And one of the cool things about this commandlet is that you can suspend the transition so that it copies everything over and holds there before you actually make the move to complete the transition. So one of the great things about that is you have stages that you can accomplish things in. You can move the mailboxes over and then wait, and then you can resume the transition perhaps at a time that's more convenient for you or your users. Okay, so why don't we take a look at this in action? Let's go take a look at our Exchange server setup. Now this is a lab setup. We didn't want to affect our live Globomantics organization, so we set up on the side an Exchange 2007 server running Service Pack 2. We created a few users, and we're going to move those users over to Exchange 2010. Let's take a look. Okay, so for starters, we're looking at our Exchange 2007 server. Now you might be wondering, well, how do we know? It looks the same as Exchange 2010. Well, you'll note the little icon. That's how you'll know that we're working on the 2007 server, because the other one is orange, and you'll see that when we go back over to the other server. Now this is the Exchange server for this organization. So this organization has mailboxes here that we want to move over to the Exchange 2010 server. Now, you can try to do it from here, but Microsoft says don't do the move mailbox from the Exchange 2007 side. Instead, we're going to move over to the Exchange 2010 server, and we're going to move those mailboxes from there. Now, to see which mailboxes have been moved and which ones need to be moved, you can't really tell just by looking at the accounts here. If we scroll over, you can see the bottom two accounts have already been moved over to the Exchange 2010 server. But the others, they're still residing on the Exchange 2007 server. So, for example, Joe User 1, that's the mailbox we're going to move at this point. Let's go over to the Exchange 2010 server, and let's follow the wizard from the Exchange Management Console to move this mailbox over. Okay, and here we are on our Exchange 2010 server, which is a member of the organization that the Exchange 2007 server really has control over at this point. So as we look here, you can see there's the orange square. That indicates that we're on the 2010 server. We're using the 2010 Exchange Management Console. Now at this point, we can see our users, and again, we don't see a difference between the users that are already on this server and those that are not. If we move over, however, we've added the column database, and you can see which ones are still on the Exchange server. Anything that's part of a storage group, that's going to be part of the 2007 world, because you recall that in 2010, storage groups are gone. So we're going to move one of these mailboxes here over to the database that's located on the Exchange server. Let's move Joe User 1. And keep in mind, even though this is the Exchange Management Console, and you might think that to accomplish things in bulk, you have to use the Exchange Management Shell, PowerShell, in order to script multiple users moving over, which is really a better way to do it if you have large numbers of users that you're going to move over. But you can actually use the Exchange Management Console by selecting multiple users, and the wizard works just fine. In this case, for the sake of simplicity, we'll go with the one user, and we're going to right-click, and you'll note you can perform a new local move request or a new remote move request. So you might be thinking, oh, this is a remote move request because I'm going to move it from a remote server, Exchange 2007, over to this local server, Exchange 2010. But in actuality, that's not the case. Local moves include moves within the Exchange organization itself. So that might include moving mailboxes from one database to another on the same Exchange server, or over to another Exchange server. And it will also include moving mailboxes from one Exchange server in the organization, for example, in our case, the Exchange 2007 server, over to the Exchange 2010 server. So it doesn't actually make a big deal out of the fact that we're performing a transition. It's simply about moving the mailbox. You can move it within the Exchange server itself to another Exchange 2010 server, from a 2007 server over to the Exchange 2010 server. The biggest thing to keep in mind here is that this is all within the same organization, within the same forest. Another important thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to make any of these moves, do not perform the move from a legacy Exchange server. Don't try to do it from the System Manager in Exchange 2003. Don't do it from the Exchange Management Console or Shell in Exchange 2007. And with 2007, that's because it's using the legacy commandlet, the move mailbox commandlet. So if you want that online experience, you're going to need to do it from the Exchange 2010 server. The other item here is new remote move request. This is for moving mailboxes to servers in another forest altogether, not within your organization, but off in another organization. And so that's not really part of the scope of a transition discussion. So we'll leave that for another time. But in our case, we're going to move the mailbox locally from one database on our legacy Exchange server over to a database on our Exchange 2010 server. So there's the mailbox that we requested to be moved. We'll click Browse to find our target mailbox database. And again, you can see that you can move it to an Exchange 2007 server or to the 2010 server. So it's not just a one-way move. It can move backwards and forwards. We select this one. We say OK. We click Next. And here you note it gives us some options about corrupted messages in a mailbox. Now the default setting is if corrupted messages are found, even one message, it will skip the mailbox completely. However, you can change that. You can say skip the corrupted messages and then present a number that you are willing to accept that are corrupted. So if there are 5 messages, 10 messages, whatever your personal threshold is here, the mailbox will still be moved, but those corrupted messages will not. Now notice it says if the maximum number of corrupted messages is exceeded, the mailbox will not be moved. So in our case, we'll leave it at skip the mailbox because we're pretty confident that there are no corrupted messages. And we'll click Next. It gives us a configuration summary, and we click New. And you can see that it completed pretty quickly, actually. So we click Finish. And you'll note the little icon has changed. Now, what does that mean? Well, you can see this icon matches up with this one down here, Move Request. If we click that, you can see it tells us the user, it tells us the alias, it tells us the move request. Now, if this was a larger mailbox, we could have come here and watched as it said moving and then completed. So the nice thing here is that we send out the request and it continues to work in the background, and you can see all of your completed move requests here. Now, you don't have to do anything at this point, but if you don't remove the move request, then you won't be able to move this mailbox again in the event you wanted to. So we'll just right-click it and click Clear Move Request. It asks if we're sure. We say yes. And now if we go back over to Mailboxes and we refresh that, you can see that the mailbox changes back to a regular mailbox icon. And if we scroll over, you can see now that the mailbox has been moved into the Exchange 2010 database. So it's really as simple as that. Once you have all of your mailboxes moved over, you can then begin eliminating your Exchange 2007 organization altogether, because none of the mailboxes that are working with 2010 will be using any of the Exchange 2007 services. And once you completely eliminate all of your 2007 or 2003 servers, well, then you move out of that state of coexistence, the transition is complete, and you have a pure Exchange 2010 environment.